Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let us all enter a posture of prayer, meditation, and reflection. Thank you, Sacred Spirit. Thank you for the privilege of celebrating the loving, reconciling mission of Mbembe, a moral exemplar of courage and wisdom. May we be inspired by his example and living legacy. May his memory awaken our spirit toward care and compassion. May his courage encourage us to fight for the right, the good, the just. We gather here for a reason. Let us not leave as we entered. Help us to be people who are strong in faith, discerning in proclamation, courageous in witness, and persistent in good deeds. For we believe today in the words of Desmond Tutu, goodness is stronger than evil, love is stronger than hate, life is stronger than death, and that we have the victory when we seek justice, when we love mercy, and we walk humbly before our God. This is our prayer. This is our plea. May we all say together, Amen and Ashe.
I want to take just a moment to invoke one of the most unforgettable days in the history of Harvard. I'm sorry that I was not yet here, but the legend and the memory of that day is so powerful, I almost feel as if I had been. Those privileged to attend the historic convocation in Nelson Mandela's honor will always remember a sunlit day in September of 1998 when he shone his grace on Harvard. They will remember Jesse Norman's soaring testimony to that amazing grace. They recall the mingling of Memorial Church's stately bells with the exuberance of African drums, the moving tributes by admirers, including two of our speakers today. They remember the Harvard University Choir's resonant voices and the embraces our guests bestowed on the students who'd sung from their hearts to honor him. Most of all, though, they remember Nelson Mandela, his radiance and gentle humor, his aura of nobility and humility and integrity, his inextinguishable devotion to freedom and equality, and his ineffable capacity to inspire, to lift every voice, to raise our sights beyond ourselves. I'm told that when the members of our university choir learned that they would have the opportunity to sing Nkosi Sikelel for Mandela, the news induced a mix of anxiety and joy. Fortunately, the Kuumba singers knew the South African anthem well as a staple in their repertoire. But just days before the convocation, word came that if the anthem was to be sung in Mandela's presence, it would be essential to include the verses not just in Xhosa, Zulu, Sotho, and English, but also in Afrikaans, the language of those who had oppressed Black South Africans for decades. And so it was sung, a harmonious expression of inclusion and reconciliation, fully befitting the man it was meant on that day to honor. Steps from here, on that afternoon, Harvard celebrated an embodiment of transcendent resilience and incandescent hope, whose like our world has seldom known. In introducing him then, my predecessor, Neil Rudenstine, quoted Mandela's famous reflection on leadership. As we join to remember Mandela here today, I want to share with you those words again. A leader, Mandela said, is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they are being directed from behind. In the persistent quest for freedom and equality, while he no longer walks among us, we know that the spirit of this great and good shepherd resides with us still. We will not forget Nelson Mandela at Harvard, and we are glad to honor his spirit here once again today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a singular honor to introduce to you this afternoon my professor and my friend, Wole Soyinka. It's not enough to say that Wole Soyinka shares those values that Nelson Mandela held most dear, a commitment to social justice and racial equality, as well as the artist's compulsion both to shed light on these matters and to write as if one's life depends upon it. For Soyinka has, in fact, lived that commitment and that compulsion for most of his nearly 80 years on Earth. Wole Soyinka is, without question, Africa's most acclaimed and most accomplished writer, becoming in 1986 the continent's very first Nobel Prize laureate in literature. His creative and political writings are as much about the human condition under pressure as they are about the challenges of development, modernity, and democracy in post-independence Africa, especially in his native Nigeria. In his plays, Yoruba myth and ritual and history are the sites of particularity through which he stages the universal drama of the human condition. In the same way, if you think about it, that Shakespeare wrote about one dilemma inherent in the human condition by situating one of his greatest plays around the difficult choices facing a prince in Denmark. Art, not ethnography. Among all that has been written about Soyinka's brilliance, the British writer Penelope Gilliatt provides perhaps my favorite line, written in 1965, the year of Soyinka's first imprisonment. And I quote, "Soyinka has done for our napping language what brigand dramatists from Ireland have done for centuries, booted it awake, rifled its pockets, and scattered the loot in the middle of next week." The image of the brigand artist is either one that Soyinka has embraced or one that has embraced Soyinka. Like Mandela, Soyinka is famous in part for the time that he spent in prison, simply because that inhumane experience so profoundly shaped both men as thinkers, writers, and political actors. In 1965, just a year after Mandela was sent to Robben Island, ostensibly for life, Soyinka was imprisoned for the first time for making a radio announcement that mocked the results of a so-called election. Fellow writers in Britain and America, including William Styron, Norman Mailer, Lillian Hellman, Lionel Trilling, and Penelope Gilliatt protested. Soyinka was freed and the charges were dismissed. But in 1967, Soyinka was arrested again and accused of treason at the start of the Nigerian Civil War. Ironically, just before his arrest, he had met secretly with the Biafran secessionist leader to plead against Biafran secession from Nigeria. For 27 months, Soyinka languished in prison, including, incredibly, ladies and gentlemen, 24 months in solitary confinement, living under the most horrific conditions, including being regularly tortured and including constant threats on his life. Deprived almost entirely of books, pen, and paper, he nonetheless wrote in secret whenever and wherever he could, on scraps of paper secreted away. in margins of the scant books he was allowed, and on toilet paper with homemade ink. He nearly died more than once, but he survived the ordeal. The Man Died, his riveting account of his imprisonment, contains what might be his most famous line. "The man dies," Soyinka writes, "in all who keep silent in the face of tyranny." Soyinka emerged from prison even more firmly wedded to the belief in the capacity of the human will to structure and restructure the world, even a world that takes all possible steps to break that will. The primacy of the will and its strength, even in the face of political forces that attempt to subdue it, attains no higher artistic expression than in Soyinka's 1975 play called Death and the King's Horseman. The play cajoles and transfigures classical Western tragedy into a literary form that is distinctly African. I can't do justice to the play this afternoon, so I'll only say that it stages the conflict between ritual communal will and the political order that attempts to, but in the end cannot, silence it. I would say crush it, but sometimes the political machine acts out of what it thinks are humane motives, pitting one idea of humanity against another idea of humanity. Hegel once famously defined tragedy not as the war between good and evil, but the war between two competing goods. And that difference, we might say, is one of the signal differences between melodrama or ideology on one hand and great art on the other. Nowhere is this definition of tragedy exemplified more poignantly in the canon of 20th century drama than in Wole Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman. Soyinka's scholarly, civic, and arts honors are legion, and there's not as much music in listing them as in listening to his words, so I'll refrain from naming them, except to say that this is not the first time that Soyinka has been with us here at Harvard. He graced our community by accepting an honorary degree in 1993, the same year that Nelson Mandela, after 27 years in prison, won the Nobel Prize for Peace with F.W. de Klerk, and a year before, Mandela cast his historic vote in the first free democratic election in that country's history, which, when all of the votes were counted, would make him the first elected president of a free, racially diverse South African republic. It's with good reason that we've asked Wole Soyinka to speak to us today on the life and legacy of his friend, Mr. Mandela. I once had the pleasure of observing these two old friends together, comrades in arms, really, in the intimacy of President Mandela's private office, reminiscing about battles they had fought, battles won, battles lost, recalling all of their hopes and expectations during the long, noble, and idealistic fight against colonialism and apartheid, sharing, quite frankly, their disappointments with various African leaders in the compromises and betrayals of those ideals made since independence. I was spellbound, ladies and gentlemen, and struck dumb with awe. I left thinking that President Mandela must be wondering whether I was Soyinka's bodyguard or his driver, or just, unfortunately, mute. I count that afternoon as one of the greatest moments in my entire life. Wole Soyinka once wrote that, and I quote, "Books and all forms of writing are terror to those who wish to suppress the truth." Soyinka's fight against tyranny of all sorts and all colors, and his conviction that the written word is the most reliable and efficient weapon in this fight, are, I believe, precisely those values that cemented his intimate friendship with Nelson Mandela. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my greatest pleasure and my cherished privilege to introduce Harvard's inaugural Hutchins Center Fellow, the 1986 Nobel Laureate for Literature, Wole Soyinka.
Thank you, Skip. I have entitled this small intervention, "The Dance is Not Over." Indeed, it does not look like stopping soon. It does not look as if it will ever stop. Frankly, I am not anxious that it should. I warned Nelson Mandela, even as I complained of being threatened by his inhuman generosity. No, not directly, but I do have it on record. Here it is, from the poem, "Your Logic Frightens Me." Your bounty threatens me, Mandela, that taut drum skin of your heart on which our millions dance. Living, the drum skin did not slacken. For 27 years on Robben Island, it did not, and now, migrated to the dwelling place of the ancestors, that drum skin refuses yet to sag. Will it ever? From the Arctic wastes of the Urals to the southernmost tip of Australasia, the world beats and dances on that drum skin. So what is it that incites and sustains this incessant evocation? We hope that the peace of the indulgent ancestors remains unbroken by this recent, irrepressible entrant to whom the entire world appears to serve as a devoted retinue, a stoic giant whose very absence now threatens to redefine eternity. So be it. In this affair, and an affair it is, in a very mortal sense, we mortals are not answerable to envious gods. When he lay ill, battling mortality, his lifelong friend and comrade pleaded with his countrymen, and indeed the world, it is time to let him go. How wrong he was, how wrong he is, and why? Well, take a look around the world today and examine most pertinently the pathetic contrast, the gallery of aliens who lay claim to the leadership of a continent. Given the assiduous abattoir of religious frenzy from which I have just emerged, I must be forgiven for succumbing to temptation and proposing a new word to distinguish the species of leaders with which the planet is cursed. I'll call it bleedership. That is what comes to my mind when I consider the ubiquitous species whose mission on the planet is to bleed, not lead, to bleed a continent dry of its human, material, even spiritual resources, of which, in my estimation, freedom is the most intimately, innately experienced by most people. Mandela was a warrior leader, but he was averse to bleedership. He proved it in South Africa, and thereby laid on the world conscience an eternal lesson. The treachery of leadership is, of course, a universal curse, more so in some places than others. Cast your glance in the direction of Syria, Somalia, Central Africa, and further away, most lately, even the Ukraine. How else describe a feudal move towards territorial theft by King Putin, an anachronistic gambit against a neighbor that just happens to be smaller and weaker? Such in-your-face provocations, designed to inaugurate new zones of human hemorrhage, compel one to reach for contrasts in responsible neighborliness and ethical leadership. As long as comparisons between the real and the possible, not even the ideal, but simply possible, are provoked into being, it becomes clear the world is simply not yet ready to let Mandela go. It is why, to speak the language of my breed of unabashed mythologists, we leave him suspended across that invisible space that I once named the transitional abyss. It is a cosmic realm through which, in Yoruba cosmology, as you just heard, the soul must pass on its journey from the living into the ancestral world, or from the world of the unborn into the world of the living. That liminal space, saturated with emanations from cosmic inhuman energies, is a way station for those we call avatars, a birthing realm for new beings, rare species of humanity. Some have chosen to see Nelson Mandela as a messiah come to earth via the prison gates. I come, however, from a culture where the pantheon expands daily and takes life from new encounters, where Godhead is not static or unitary, but expands, it's multiple, and is replenished daily by makers of new histories, bearers of new visions and new designs. That transitional realm I have renamed in my private mythology Mandeland, the dwelling place of avatars. When I was called upon to add my pennyworth to the tidal waves of eulogies after his death, I had only this pronouncement to make. I quote, "The soul of Africa is departed, and there is nothing left miraculous in the whole wide world." Those who recall their Antony and Cleopatra know that there was nothing original about those lines. The only arresting aspect was a personal one. Perhaps it was the spontaneity with which my mind flew to such a passage in the original, which reads, "The crown of the sun is melted, and there is nothing marvelous left in the whole wide world." Well, one can only try. There's only one Shakespeare, just as there's only one Mandela. Only later, in retrospect, did that play strike me as being singularly appropriate as source. The entire wide world has been having a love affair with a person called Mandela, including those who were not even born at the time of the Rivonia trials, or those who never heard of a bearded revolutionary named Fidel Castro, and his equally legendary defense, Historia me absolvera, history will absolve me. It is within that ancient tradition, Martin Luther, his eponymous civil rights leader, King, and others, that Mandela's Rivonia affirmation belongs and continues to be a challenge to the world. Yet there is a critical difference among the followers of that path. That difference is caught, I think, in the afterthoughts that followed my spontaneous recourse to Cleopatra's lines. I recognize it very simply as a phenomenon of love. Those who doubt it need only recall what happened after Fidel Castro's triumph in Cuba, the fate that befell immediately the followers of his opponents, the followers of Batista. Antony and Cleopatra, with some competition here and there, of course, is often referred to as the greatest love story that the world has ever known. Perhaps it is a love story because it is a love story with a historic sweep, a grandeur that is missing from, for instance, one of its major rivals, Romeo and Juliet. The love we are speaking of, however, is of utterly different attributes from both, or indeed from the many dramatic essays on that rapture called love, to which humanity is so prone. Mandela's is marked by an abnormal largesse, call it universal compassion. This is that which makes it possible for the world to reciprocate and remain enamored with a legend, a return that Nelson Mandela himself recognized and respected, though I remain convinced that it did eventually become a burden from which he had to be protected. For me, early and fortuitous evidence of his resignation to this life burden took place shortly after his release when he traveled to Jamaica. So all I've done once again is simply borrow words, this time Mandela's, or one word, from a seemingly insignificant incident that narrated his condition, his submission to fate, his acknowledgement of that life burden which such a dimension of love inevitably entails. By one of those remarkable accidents of timing, I was physically in Jamaica at the time Nelson Mandela arrived for a civic reception. The tumultuous scene can only be conjectured. Even the Dons, those murderous garrison lords of Jamaican criminal turfs, had declared a total truce and were even reportedly present at the event with all their lieutenants. Eventually, even Jamaica's irrepressible ardor died down. Madiba mounted the podium, looked to one side, then the other, reaching instinctively for his prepared speech. I've forgotten some of the details of that incident, Mandela's first visit to the Caribbean, but the core happening was this. On this special outing, Mandela's first to that island, or the Caribbean, Mandela was robbed. The folder containing his speech, supposedly kept by one of his aides, had vanished. In the melee that submerged that short passage between him and between the car and the venue, the world's #1 prisoner, ex-prisoner, had been dispossessed. It all fitted in. Dispossessed of land for centuries, dispossessed of freedom for a generation. It was a fitting coda that he should be dispossessed of his words, but this time, triumphantly, among his own people, in the diaspora, and also through, in his own submission, a crime of love. For this was precisely Nelson Mandela's response to that act of, to you and me perhaps, violation. Certainly an inhospitable act, inconsiderate, if not downright disrespectful. As the officials, security, and hosts flapped around like stranded fish, wondering what to do, he simply gave his broad smile and said, "Don't worry, it was simply excess love." And he proceeded to deliver an impromptu address. The world's love is expressed in so many different ways. Purloining an essential active souvenir, as opposed to, let us say, beard shavings, for instance, may seem unkind and thoughtless. But, well, love does different things to different people in different ways. Many people love to be in love with a legend. They do not wish to be left high and dry, while the rest of the world is immersed in waves of a universal love fest. Others simply wish to bask in the glow of a phenomenon, a rarity that seems unlikely to be manifested ever again in their lifetimes. For a vast majority, however, I believe that the adulation goes deeper, much deeper, and ironically, even simpler. I believe that even among those who have never undergone the condition of servitude in whatever form, and perhaps cannot even empathize with those who have, there is an innate recognition of a basic constituent of what we call humanity. I mentioned the word earlier. It is known quite simply as freedom, that ineradicable human right to self-volition, suppressed even sometimes across generations, sometimes, as we have learned to learn, even across centuries. It remains embedded somewhere in the human gene, dormant, obscured by the seeming acceptance of a condition of subservience, of external imposition. One day, however, from an unrecognizable source, from an alien nowhere of circumstance, often not immediately traceable to source, it erupts. Every revolution, every human uprising is subject to objective analysis. Even before it happens, the iniquitous material circumstances of society, disparities in material possessions, privileges, and opportunities, etc., make it possible to predict its coming eruption. Afterwards, of course, there is the post facto analysis. Our most recent example is the so-named Arab Spring that began in Africa's Maghreb region and swept away decades of feudal dictatorship, which to all appearances had become enshrined as a way of life for life. But suddenly, it happens. We are left to cite history, economics, statistics. These can even be transmitted in the language of quantification. There is, however, a less palpable trigger that is often understated, a subjective product of objective conditions, an enabling factor in origin or intensity, one that is often dismissed as an irrelevant factor, regarded as mushy, undialectical, almost theological in apprehension, even much given to sloganeering. That particle is freedom, undiluted, unqualified, a test of humanity and its essence of completion. Yes, very simply, freedom and the dignity that comes with it. Everyone understands what it is. Its deprivation creates a tension, even within the individual, but most commonly between the individual and the external world. Be that externality known as family, clan, community, state, or nation, religion, tradition, etc., freedom are sought even in factory floor drudgery for an absentee boss. It represents one end of a historic axis, indeed an eternal one. Bondage at one end and freedom at the other. On that axis, control and submission spins the history of humanity. Take the notorious instance of this extortionist relationship, slavery, so recently thrust to the forefront of cinematic expression in these parts. Economic factors are rightly cited as the basis of the slave trade. Capital investment in practice and its prolonged, stubborn retention, just as that same factor also played a role in the move towards abolition. Nevertheless, the definition of that inhuman condition called bondage or servitude is what is experienced by the victim, the absence of freedom. And that, let us be clear about this is the ultimate factor in social revolt, the triggering mechanism that detonates the critical mass of individual or communal resentment. This, I'm persuaded, is what is subconsciously absorbed into the minds and emotions of millions as they watch Nelson Mandela, turned embodiment of universal being, a recognition that each human entity remains incomplete without the felt essence of freedom, that one's humanity is a sham without the self-realization it confers. And thus, both through objective history and subjective temperament, Mandela stands tall, even today, as the very expression of that innermost craving of each and every one of us. Nearly 3 decades of loss of freedom in pursuit of and in defense of that essence of human validation. It is thus an affair of self-love that comes from inner recognition, from inner directed empathy as the first stage. It becomes infectious, communally embraced, then conferred, bestowed, and projected onto a deserving protagonist of our innermost craving. This is how the mythology, the figures of mythology come into existence, the figures of rebellion against seeming omnipotency. The Promethean in each human entity, the Ogun essence in whatever guise, Loki in the defiance of Thor. One of my favorite stories during the Nigerian experience of dictatorship under the murderous regime of one General Sani Abacha was enacted on the podium of the United Nations. I've cited it on a few occasions, but that story has a very special relevance to this occasion, so forgive me if you've heard it before. The nation's representative, Nigeria that is, stood on the podium of the United Nations before the world to defend the indefensible. And what were the words he used? That defense went thus. And remember, democracy is often another word for freedom in action. And he said, can we eat democracy? Can we put it in a pot and cook it like food? This government is transforming agriculture so as to make food available for everyone. The government is even sanitizing the banking system, yet we have people shouting, democracy, democracy, democracy. Can people eat democracy? Now let me situate that story in its full contextual horror. Nigeria was on trial before the world for executing 9 environmental activists led by the writer Ken Saro-Wiwa. They were all hanged, you will recall, after a kangaroo trial, a so-called trial of such a cynical negation of just proceeding that the defense lawyers in what became known as the Ogoni 9 trial had no choice but to withdraw. The United Nations, heads of the states from all over the world, led by Nelson Mandela, interceded and pleaded that the Nigerian government commute those death sentences. The UN sent a delegation to Nigeria. Nelson Mandela personally phoned the Nigerian dictator, Sani Abacha, and obtained from him assurance that the sentence would not be carried out. Sani Abacha defied the world. In an act of unbelievable contempt for his peers who were gathered in New Zealand for a summit of the Commonwealth heads of state, Abacha chose that very moment of the opening of the conference to hang all 9. I traveled to Auckland to take up position for the arrival of the heads of states, so I was present when Nelson Mandela arrived for the summit. My mission was to impress on those leaders the need to intensify the pressure on Abacha. I knew what a full-blown psychopath he was, that the world was also dealing with. When Nelson Mandela landed at the airport, he was predictably bombarded by the world press, only one topic on their minds: what was going on in Nigeria? What was likely to be the fate of the Ogoni 9? Was Mandela in communication with the dictator, and so on and on and on? Mandela waved them off blithely, assured them that he had received personal assurance from the very man in whose hands lay the fate of the writer Ken Saro-Wiwa and his comrades. He even chided the press lightheartedly for sensationalizing the situation. Alas, he did not know Sani Abacha. Even Nelson Mandela could not conceive of Abacha. It was clearly written on his face, transparent in his body language. Mandela's confidence only made us redouble our efforts, hounding the foreign ministers in their hotels and waylaying a few heads of state. With only one exception or two, they all displayed the same insouciance. How, they demanded, could Sani Abacha hang those men in the midst of world intervention and on the eve of the Commonwealth Conference, of which Nigeria was a part? One of them, I'll never forget this, certainly not forget the snide smile on his face that went with the words. He said to me, "Mr. Soyinka, don't you think, no offense meant, but don't you think you're getting carried away by your dramatist temperament?" Well, that diplomat lived to apologize to me when we met a year or so later. The world, like him, was wrong. And it was the only time that I've known Mandela publicly blow his top. Anguish and anger are release valves for thwarted love. The statesman vanished. The disciplined revolutionary evaporated. There was only his naked being left, his human essence. And he lashed out from the depths of anguish, from the depths of his violated love for humanity. And so we come to my favorite pronouncement of Nelson Mandela, one that defines him, for me, for all time, and sums up the inner core of his being. It was not even the words in themselves, but the spontaneity, the utter sincerity of his anguish. No dissembling, no evasion, simply the unvarnished outburst of violated humanity. He said, "Sani Abacha is sitting on a volcano, and I shall detonate it under him." Those words, that moment, remain my most memorable gift from Nelson Mandela. It was an annunciation of what had to be done, an affirmation of what was already being done. We all take our bits and pieces out of avatars, discarding the rest. Questions will always raise their heads, such as, did the avatar ever falter? Did he ever act in contradiction of his own principles? We must be honest in our assessment. I would dare say, for instance, that my avatar struck me sometimes as naive when it came to capturing the potential depths of human depravity and derangement. Naive might sound an irreverent expression to apply to someone of Mandela's wisdom and stature, but he was. Ask Desmond Tutu and Graça Samora Machel about a private dinner we three had together one evening in, I think, Pretoria or Johannesburg. It was very soon after his release. There were just Desmond Tutu, Graça, and I to begin with. Then he joined us, I was told, from an ANC meeting. The dinner subject had turned to the deceased, self-styled King of Africa, the Libyan dictator, Colonel Gaddafi. Nelson Mandela had extended to him a hand of solidarity at a time when Gaddafi's sadistic rule over his own people had moved beyond excuses or denial. Mandela's perception was straightforward. A ruler who had given political and material support to the South African struggle could not be the monster that was painted by especially the Western press and powers. Desmond Tutu, Gasha Machel, and I were ranged against him. We pressed our argument, attacked him with his own animating credo, the basic right of the African citizen, like any other, to freedom, insisting that this must form the heartbeat of liberation, without qualification. Mandela was stuck over the issue of loyalty, so each side operated from a totally different set of parameters. I obtained a feeling that Nelson Mandela secretly acknowledged that he'd been hoisted on the horns of a dilemma. In the hour of need, at the height of the anti-apartheid struggle, Gaddafi had proved a dependable ally, while the Western world dithered and compromised, applied double standards in their policies towards such zones of conflict. And so it went on that evening. Let us recall this, however. Mandela's notion of loyalty was of a totally different quality from what I call the solidarity of the school tie that animated most members of the Club of African Leaders. You assist me in sticking to power no matter what, and I shall reciprocate in kind, no matter what I do to my own people. No, Mandela had no taste for personal survival, for self-perpetuation. His world was encapsulated in the totality of human liberation. To all those who made that liberation a reality or acted to attain it, his loyalty became a duty. That evening, as he took his leave of us, it was clear, to me at least, that it was with a heavy heart. Avatars are also human, and so we slice them, not dismember them or take them apart, simply slice and appropriate those parts of them that answer our multivalent challenges, knowing that the totality of an avatar cannot be grasped even on a holistic ground of humanistic considerations. My choice of the avatar slices is as subjective as that of the next individuals, and I freely admit it. That choice remains: Sani Abacha is sitting on a volcano, and I shall detonate it under him. I learned later of the intense agony that this crime had caused him, and how additionally excruciating was the aftermath when the protagonist of political pragmatism in his government compelled him to backpedal from whatever course of action against the Nigerian government he had determined and strongly advocated. It hardly mattered. Nelson Mandela should not be expected to fight all the battles of the continent or of the world. It was sufficient that he had exposed the core of his inner being in response to an inhuman violation. So it was up to us to actively reciprocate that love, generous, expansive, and unfolding. It is precisely why, despite whatever frailties we presume to discern, despite errors of judgment we assign to Mandela, the statesman, the avatar remains intact. The dance continues. It is why the drum skin holds firm and not merely as wistful memory. We all need a touchstone. Until the world of political leadership is populated, not even totally, but simply in the main, by leaders with a genuine love of humanity, demonstrable in their actions, the world cannot quite let Nelson Mandela go. The dance is anything but over. Thank you.
Wole, those were moving words. Thank you. Our next speaker once famously wrote, and I quote, "The Massachusetts Constitution affirms the dignity, and equality of all individuals. It forbids the creation of second-class citizens, unquote. Margaret Marshall crafted these words in her role as Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts for the far-sighted and path-breaking decision to legalize same-sex marriage in the Commonwealth. But in underscoring, and I quote again, the constitutional principles of respect for individual autonomy and equality under the law, unquote, Chief Justice Marshall was drawing from a deep reservoir of personal experience with and resistance to injustice in her native South Africa. As a teen from the village of Newcastle in South Africa, young Margie Marshall, as that's what she told me she was called in those days, came as a high school exchange student to Wilmington, Delaware, and found the unexpected. She witnessed the early days of the civil rights movement in the United States, with the attendant protest marches, speeches, and sit-ins, all of which were illegal in her country. She watched Walter Cronkite, some of us here can remember that, and experienced uncensored news for the first time in her life. She was able to read Cry the Beloved Country, which was banned in South Africa. Of that time, she has since said, quote, "Once one's mind is opened, it's very difficult to shut it again. I literally felt as if the blinders had been removed from me." Returning to South Africa, she enrolled in the University of Witwatersrand, better known as WITS, in Johannesburg, which I'm told was also Nelson Mandela's alma mater, and was elected president of the National Union of South African Students, a coalition of university student councils that opposed apartheid. She attended trials of anti-apartheid activists, including Nelson Mandela's lawyer, and saw many of them exiled, jailed, tortured, and murdered. She knew that she too was being watched by the security police and feared, she reports every night, that she would be taken away and, to use the term of the day, disappear. In 1966, Robert F. Kennedy accepted the invitation of Marshall's student organization to give an address, which later became famous, at the University of Cape Town. In that speech, RFK used words that reverberate today. He said, "Each time a man stands up for an idea, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression." Shortly after that, Margaret Marshall came to the United States to build her life here, and we are very fortunate that she did. In addition to her service as Chief Justice, she served Harvard as General Counsel and Yale as a senior fellow of their corporation. In all three cases, she was the first woman ever to do so. But most important, coming from a country where the courts and police functioned as instruments of oppression, she embraced and advanced the American legal system as an instrument of compassion, of fairness, and progress, as a ripple of hope. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce to you Chief Justice Margaret Marshall.
So let me begin just by complaining to Professor Gates that she put me after the Nobel Prize winner. Give me a moment to get organized here. I like the dreams of the future rather than the history of the past. President Faust, Mr. Hutchins, Professor Gates, members of the Harvard community, it is hard for me to capture what I feel at this moment, how honored I am to be here. The death of President Nelson Mandela on December the 5th, 2013, sparked a tsunami of tributes to this great man. This afternoon's commemorative event, some 4 months later, is a welcome moment in our busy lives when we can pause and reflect more deeply on his lasting contributions to our world. I like the dreams of the future rather than the history of the past. The tributes to President Mandela have focused, understandably, on his personal qualities. He was, wrote the New York Times, an international emblem of dignity and forbearance. The question most often asked about Mr. Mandela, the Times continued, was how, after whites had systematically humiliated his people, tortured and murdered many of his friends, and cast him into prison for 27 years, he could be so evidently free of spite. He lived reconciliation. He was a great unifier, said F.W. de Klerk, the white South African president, who freed Mandela from prison. I share in those tributes, perhaps because here, where our nation is so deeply divided on so many issues, where words like unifier, forbearance, and freedom from spite are so absent from our political vocabulary, we are drawn to this man and to this image of him. Today I commemorate another great attribute of Mandela, his deep, his profound, his lasting commitment to the rule of law. I like the dreams of the future rather than the history of the past. I speak to you as a judge, as a woman, as an immigrant from South Africa to the United States. I speak to you as one whose devotion to the rule of law and to those who nurture and respect it originates in my own experience of the arbitrary, often brutal abuse of official power in the South Africa of my early life. And almost no one experienced that abuse of power more keenly, more intensely than Nelson Mandela. I remember President Mandela recalled in an NPR interview in 2004, we adjourned for lunch, and a friendly Afrikaner warder asked me the question, Mandela, what do you think is going to happen to you in this case? I said to him, they are going to hang us. Now, Mandela continued, I was really expecting some word of encouragement from him. And I thought he was going to say, man, that can never happen. But he came serious, and then he said, I think you are right. They are going to hang you. Those of you who grew up in the United States or another democracy may take for granted the central importance of the rule of law and the principle of equal justice. I never can. Apartheid's laws had one primary aim: to protect and consolidate the power of the powerful, white South Africans. In the United States, my work as a judge has shown me every day what I sensed intuitively when I arrived here 48 years ago, the genius of a constitutional democracy with a government of diffused and balanced powers, limited by a fundamental charter of rights, enforced by neutral, independent judges. In South Africa, Mandela led his country to embrace those values, respect and entrench the values of the rule of law built on a written guarantee of fundamental rights enforced by independent judges. As a keen political strategist, he well understood that the white apartheid government would never agree to form a parliamentary democracy, where the African National Congress would have, at least initially, the overwhelming number of votes in any new parliament. As the key negotiator, before and after his release from prison, Mandela embraced a new constitution with a charter of rights and an independent judicial branch whose duty it would be to uphold and enforce the constitution. Second, a new constitutional court, Mandela knew, would play a critical role in South Africa's future. The court consists of 11 judges appointed by the president. The first appointments to the court had to be widely respected. They were. Drawn from across the political spectrum, his appointments came from all races, included women and men, and a justice who was blind. As the first Chief Justice, Mandela appointed a brilliant lawyer from the Johannesburg Bar, Arthur Chaskelson. Chaskelson, who died in 2012, was white. Under his leadership, the court quickly emerged as one of the leading constitutional courts in the world, whose opinions are still routinely quoted by other courts internationally. I like the dreams of the future rather than the history of the past. Third, and perhaps most important of all, I vividly recall the moment I knew that constitutional democracy had taken hold in South Africa. In September 1995, before the first free elections, the new court ruled that Mandela's party had violated the new constitution by establishing election boundaries without enabling parliamentary legislation. This was a stunning defeat for the African National Congress, coming as it did just weeks before the first election. You will recall the pictures of long, snaking lines as millions of people waited patiently to exercise the vote, the first for the majority of them. The following day, the Associated Press began its story about the court judgment as follows. The Constitutional Court handed Nelson Mandela his first major defeat as president on Friday. But instead of reacting angrily, Mandela called the ruling, quote, a victory for South Africa, confirming, Mandela said, that our new democracy is taking firm root and that nobody is above the law. This is something of which we should be proud and which the whole of our country must welcome. A new political leader handed a stinging defeat by a constitutional court stands on the steps of Parliament announcing his respect for the rule of law and inviting his country to stand proud. It was a rare moment of constitutional political leadership in any country. Mandela continued his open and vocal support for the Constitutional Court. The first major decision of the new court was to declare the imposition of the death penalty unconstitutional. The ruling was controversial because the subject of the death penalty had been closely examined in the lengthy constitutional negotiations, and in the end, the new constitution had not prohibited the death penalty. The following day, F.W. de Klerk, now vice president in South Africa's coalition transition government, attacked the court's decision. The overwhelming majority of South Africans support the death penalty, he said. He was surely correct on that point. His party, which had governed the country for decades, would campaign, he said, to reinstate capital punishment. The question of amending the Constitution to allow for the death penalty should be put to a referendum vote. Rather than attacking the court or his deputy, Mandela responded that there should be not one, but two referenda questions. First, whether the death penalty should be abolished, and second, whether the constitutional provision protecting ownership of the land, almost all white-owned, should also be abolished. The idea of overturning an unpopular constitutional decision by popular vote was dead. I like the dreams of the future rather than the history of the past. Nelson Mandela spoke at the inauguration of the South African Constitutional Court on February the 14th, 1995. People come and people go, he said. Customs, fashions, and preferences change. Yet the web of fundamental rights and justice, which a nation proclaims, must not be broken. It is the task of this court to ensure that the values of freedom and equality which underline our Constitution are nurtured and protected so that they may endure. The court accepted its role. There is often a divide between law and justice in the sense that law prescribes certain actions, and the outcome of that is not always just as far as the individual caught up in the case is concerned, said Chief Justice Chaskelson in an interview in 2004. The great challenge today is to try to bring law and justice closer together. That is one of the requirements of our Constitution. If you look at the fundamental values of our Constitution, he said, they entrench dignity, equality, freedom, and democracy. And so the law should be in line with that. I like the dreams of the future rather than the history of the past. Thomas Jefferson wrote those words to John Adams on August the 1st, 1816. Adams replied, "Your taste is judicious in liking better the dreams of the future than the history of the past. Upon this principle, I prophesy that you and I shall meet and be better friends than ever." I have walked the long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way, but I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can rest only for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended. Achille, Mandela.
Thank you, Chief Justice Marshall, for your careful reflections and thought-provoking remarks. We will now hear President Mandela's own words, read by Professor Lawrence Bobo and Maria Makabane. Professor Bobo will read from Mandela's biography, Long Walk to Freedom, published in 1995, and Ms. Makabane will read from Mandela's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, delivered in 1993.
It is my honor to read to you an excerpt from Long Walk to Freedom, the autobiography of Nelson Mandela, and to echo some of the thoughts you've just heard. As a young man in Johannesburg, I yearned for the basic honorable freedoms of achieving my potential, of earning my keep, of marrying and having a family, the freedom not to be obstructed in a lawful life. But then I slowly saw that not only was I not free, but my brothers and sisters were not free. I saw that it was not just my freedom that was curtailed, but the freedom of everyone who looked like I did. That is when I joined the African National Congress. And that is when the hunger for my own freedom became the greater hunger for the freedom of my people. It was this desire for the freedom of my people to live their lives with dignity and self-respect that animated my life, that transformed a frightened young man into a bold one, that drove a law-abiding attorney to become a criminal, that turned a family-loving husband into a man without a home, that forced a life-loving man to live like a monk. I am no more virtuous or self-sacrificing than the next man, but I found that I could not even enjoy the poor and limited freedoms I was allowed when I knew my people were not free. Freedom is indivisible. The chains on any one of my people were the chains on all of them. The chains on all of my people were the chains on me. It was during those long and lonely years that my hunger for the freedom of my own people became a hunger for the freedom of all people, white and black. I knew as well as I knew anything that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is a prisoner of hatred. He is locked behind the bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. I am not truly free if I am taking away someone else's freedom, just as surely as I am not free when my freedom is taken from me. The oppressed and the oppressor are robbed of their humanity. When I walked out of prison, that was my mission, to liberate the oppressed and the oppressor both. Some say that has now been achieved, but I know that that is not the case. The truth is that we are not yet free. We have merely achieved the freedom to be free, the right not to be oppressed. We have not taken the final step of our journey, but the first step on a long and even more difficult road. For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. The true test of our devotion to freedom is just beginning. And now to echo Justice Marshall. I have walked that long road to freedom. I have tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can rest only for a moment, for with freedom come responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended.
I am honored to read excerpts from Nelson Mandela's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech. I stand here today as nothing more than a representative of the millions of people who dared to rise up against the social system whose very essence was war, violence, racism, oppression, repression, and the impoverishment of an entire people. I am also here today as a representative of the millions of people across the globe, the anti-apartheid movement, the governments and organizations that joined with us, not to fight against South Africa as a country or any of its people, but to oppose an inhumane system and sue for a speedy end to the apartheid crime against humanity. These countless human beings, both inside and outside our country, had the nobility of spirit to stand in the path of tyranny and injustice without seeking selfish gain. They recognized that an injury to one is an injury to all. And therefore they acted together in defense of justice and a common human decency. Because of their courage and persistence over many years, we can, today, even set the dates when all humanity will join together to celebrate one of the outstanding human victories of our century. When that moment comes, we shall, together, rejoice in a common victory over racism, apartheid, and white minority rule. That triumph will finally bring to a close a history of 500 years of African colonization that began with the establishment of the Portuguese Empire. Thus, it will mark a great step forward in history and also serve as a common pledge of the peoples of this world to fight racism wherever it occurs and whatever guise it assumes. I live with the hope that as she battles to remake herself, South Africa will be like a microcosm of the new world striving to be born. This must be a world of democracy and respect for human rights, a world freed from the horrors of poverty, hunger, deprivation, and ignorance, relieved of the threat and the scourge of civil war and external aggression, and unburdened of the great tragedy of millions forced to become refugees. The processes in which South Africa and Southern Africa as a whole are engaged beckon and urge us all to take this tide at the flood and make of this region a living example of what all people of conscience would like the world to be. Let the strivings of us all prove Martin Luther King Jr. to have been correct when he said that humanity can no longer be tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war. Let the efforts of us all prove that he was not a mere dreamer when he spoke of the beauty of genuine brotherhood and peace being more precious than diamonds or silver or gold. Let a new age be born.
Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, or as he is affectionately known in South Africa, Tata Madiba, may have been and may long continue to be a global icon, a local hero, a cipher for the centuries into which us more ordinary souls will continue to pour our aspirations, our arguments for a better world, our sense of nobility lost. But Tata Madiba also embodied the contradictions, the ambiguities, the equivocations and equivocalities from which all real political figures, all real historical struggles are wrought. His walk to freedom was indeed long. It was also, as he was wont to freely admit, paved with imperfections, with opportunities unseen, possibilities passed by, mistakes made. To be sure, greatness has never lain in perfection. It has always depended on a delicate fusion, an ineluctable equation, if you will, of intellectual acumen, of ethical discipline, and of searching self-criticism. To the degree that Tata Madiba embodied greatness, and there is more than a little argument in South Africa about just that right now, that greatness lay in major part in his own capacity to criticize and to take criticism, to deal with difference in a spirit of reason. For him, history-making and hagiography were antithetical, a point which we should bear in mind as we consider the shifting, the multiple meanings of the man in our collective memory. He was the first to point out that he was no saint. And so we move, in the spirit of Madiba and in the spirit of Harvard, from our hour of remembrance to our hour of critical engagement. Critique here, of course, does not simply mean censure or stricture. It denotes the effort to comprehend anew, to subject to rigorous interrogation, to suspend the mythic in the cause of greater understanding. That is the work of this moment. To undertake it, we've invited three panelists, each of whom has a deep connection to South Africa. In alphabetical order, our three panelists, whose longer bios are in the program, are first Adam Habib, one of South Africa's most distinguished political thinkers and currently Vice-Chancellor of the University of the Witwatersrand, also known as WITS, which, with extraordinary vision and energy, is rapidly transforming into a leading global institution of research and pedagogy. Vice-Chancellor, with those unfamiliar with the South African Academy, is the equivalent of a US university provost and president rolled into one. Second, Margaret Marshall, who's already been introduced to you, until 2010, Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, the first woman ever to hold that position. Chief Justice Marshall, as Glenn Hutchins has already intimated, is famed for her fearless jurisprudence. She's now Senior Research Fellow here at Harvard Law School. And Achille Mbembe is widely recognized as one of Africa's foremost scholars and public intellectuals. He's also a towering figure in the French as well as the English-speaking academic world. Dr. Mbembe is currently professor at the University of Witwatersrand and a major figure at its Institute for Social and Economic Research, also known as WISER, of which he's among the wisest. And to offer a closing comment at the end of our panel discussion, Jean Comaroff, Alfred North Whitehead Professor of African and African American Studies and of Anthropology here at Harvard, where she's also an Oppenheimer Research Fellow in African Studies. Let me begin by asking each of you for a brief opening statement, a synoptic comment on what, from your own critical vantage in the present, in the broadest terms, you take to be the most significant legacy of Nelson Mandela. In answering this, let me ask you to bear in mind a radical contrast between the polar opposite views of two public intellectuals in South Africa. On the one hand, Zaki Ahmad, who has said that Madiba was not merely the best president the country has ever had, but his presidency yielded our most impressive public policies. And on the other hand, Andile Mqimtama, who, in excoriating Madiba, argues that his leadership was characterized by accommodation with the oppressors and will be forgotten, Pachewole, if not rejected, within a generation. Wherein lies your synoptic point of departure to a reading of the meaning of Mandela Adam, would you like to begin?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me here. I wanted to start off before responding to that, by making in a few seconds a commentary that I do think that Madiba's legacy is under threat. In the days that he passed on, you saw the world's, both the national and global media, speak about a man of pragmatism. They spoke a man who believed in political reconciliation. These were important points and important characteristics of Madiba. But it seems to me that Madiba was more. Madiba was a Democrat. He believed in the rule of law. He believed in non-racialism. And most importantly, I think, he was somebody who was committed to economic egalitarianism. And what we tend to do is we cherry pick those parts of the Madiba legacy that we find convenient. So every corporate, even those with the worst labor practices in our society, tend to pick on Madiba and say he was the ultimate pragmatist, and therefore they push unions and others to start engaging in negotiations and use his legacy in the most cynical of ways. It seemed to me that this is a point that President Obama himself said at the memorial service. But he too cherry-picked Madiba's legacy, because Madiba would have been as opposed to drone attacks and political assassinations and Guantanamo Bay. And I think it's important. I think it's important that as we talk about Madiba, that we recognize that if we want to be truly honest to his legacy, we need to defend the entirety of his legacy, not simply those elements that we find particularly convenient. Responding to your question, I think Madiba, in a lot of ways, his most significant contribution was that he midwifed modern-day South Africa. And he did that through a significant event in 1993, when Chris Hani was murdered. Chris Hani was the General Secretary of the South African Communist Party. And when he was assassinated in front of his child, who was then 7 years old, the country was on the verge of an explosion. I remember being in a township in Cape Town, and the country, there were tires being set up, and the country was at that moment ripe for burning. And at that moment, de Klerk asked Madiba to make the State of the Nation address. The symbolic moment where he conceded. He never ran this country. What he did is he asked you to think of this, the leader of the opposition, to make the State of the Nation address. And Madiba takes to the airwaves, and he asks young people to stand down. He asks young people not to use this as an opportunity to burn South Africa, not to use this as an opportunity to attack whites, but to use this as the leverage by which to bring the transition to a conclusion. And by doing that, and the subsequent reconciliation efforts in 1994 and 1995, he gives birth, if you like, to the new South Africa. But that new South Africa comes with costs. It achieved a level of political inclusion, but it also compelled the ANC to be moderate in its economic interventions. And while we've had growth in the last 20 years, every single year, while we've had poverty alleviation, we've also grown economic inequalities every single year for 20 years. We've become the most unequal society in the world. And what that has done is polarize society. And in those graphic pictures you saw of labor strikes and people being killed, of violent service delivery protests, what you're beginning to see is the failure of economic inclusion is now threatening the political inclusion that Madiba gave birth to. And so in a sense, I think we need to be measured in our analysis. Madiba made a massive contribution by enabling political inclusion. But unless economic inclusion becomes the corollary of that, we could see that political inclusion itself threatened. Stop there, thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I'm actually going to return to cherry picking and pragmatism. So you've in fact initiated themes that are going to return over and over, for which thank you. Achille.
Look, I only met Nelson Mandela once at his headquarters of his foundation in Walton, Johannesburg. As I was getting ready to greet him, he looked at me and he asked me, "Oh, young man, what happened to your hair?" I told him I didn't want it to turn like yours or like Soyinka's. And he said, "Very good, very good," in the way in which he used to say that. I think that Mandela had at least two faces, one of which is not very much spoken about in the multitude of testimonies we have heard since he passed away. One face of Mandela is that of a very radical and uncompromising fighter who committed himself selflessly, paid a heavy price, risked his own life, committed himself to one basic idea, which has been absolutely central to most of the tradition of black struggle almost everywhere here in America, in the Caribbean, elsewhere. The idea that we want to be treated just like any other human being, which is a very simple idea, but with very huge implications. He was committed to that, what Soyinka was calling the right to constituent humanity. And he was committed to that, not only in the name of black people who were struggling against apartheid in South Africa, but in the name of humanity at large, as we just heard from excerpts from his the speech in Oslo when he was receiving the Nobel Prize. The second idea was the idea of an intrinsic commonality between human beings, which implied a certain level of mutuality, that in fact apartheid damaged not only its black victims, but also its white oppressors, which is an idea we also find in the works of Fanon, in the works of many other black thinkers. So it seems to me that those two ideas, a fundamental claim to justice, totally uncompromising, and the opening up of an imagination for something common, are the two most powerful legacies he leaves with us. And that's why his passing, let's say the memory of Mandela, is a memory for, of all of us. Adam is absolutely right. The situation we experience today in South Africa is extremely complex. A lot has been done, but there are still too many people without a voice. The cost of a voice is increasing, especially among the poor, and we are at risk of building in South Africa a democracy, especially of propertyless citizens. And a democracy of propertyless citizens is not viable. That's why, if nothing changes, we'll see in the coming years a resurgence of the radical side of Mandela. The face it will take, the name that will be given to it, all of that is open-ended.
Thank you. Of course, that lesson is not merely a South African lesson. It's a lesson that is replicated in this country. It's replicated through much of the global north, as well as it is elsewhere. By the way, the invocation of Madiba humor is worth, in fact, marking here. We sometimes forget in the commemoration, in the augustness of the man, that he had a wicked sense of humor. Most notably, his exchange about clothing with Archbishop Tutu, who once criticized him for, instead of wearing suits on public occasions, wearing florid African-designed shirts, to which his response was, "Am I going to take advice from a little man who wears a blue frock?" End of story. Margie.
I want to pick up just there, and Professor Mbembe's wonderful comment about we want to be treated just like every human being. So this is a true anecdote. A colleague, it wasn't me, was sitting with then President Mandela, and his aide came in, and as they sat down, he said to her, "I'm terribly sorry, there is one call that I have to take. It's from Queen Elizabeth. When it comes through," she said, "Of course, that's fine." And the aide came in and nodded, and Mandela picked up the phone. "Elizabeth," he said. And then proceeded to have a conversation. And when he put down the phone, she said, "But you can't call her Elizabeth." "Why?" he said. "She calls me Nelson, I call her Elizabeth." It was a wonderful story. I want to inject into what is an obvious point about the growing economic disparity in South Africa, and that too many people are without a voice. We are extremely good at forgetting history. In the United States, particularly good at doing that, and sometimes that's a positive because we don't continue to fight wars of events that took place 1,000 years ago, which we sometimes see in parts of the world. But it sometimes is a disservice. And South Africans suffer from a similar lack of history. When the nationalist government came to power just in 1948, it was a shock to the white South Africans who voted. They were the only people who voted, other than a small group of coloreds, so-called coloreds in the Western Cape. And at that time, Afrikaners were terribly poor. I don't mean lower middle class. I mean terribly poor. The first commission on poverty, looking into the causes of poverty in South Africa, the so-called Malherbe Commission, was aimed at white Afrikaners. And the reason was very simple. All of the economic wealth, all of it, rested in the hands of English-speaking South Africans. The banks, the mines, the diamond, the gold mines, everything was in the hands of English-speaking South Africans. And the White Afrikaner Party proceeded to use the instruments of government power to transform that, systematically and deliberately. So, there were Afrikaans banks that were established. You needed government permission to do that. There were Afrikaans insurance companies that were established. The civil servants in South Africa, service in South Africa became the place of employment where white South Africans could get jobs, white Afrikaner South Africans, in the Department of Revenue, in the Department of Motor Vehicles, in every department in government. When I went to school as an English-speaking South African, none of us, none of our parents, nobody worked for the civil service. It was all for Afrikaners. And if I may say so, the disparity between rich and poor grew greater and greater and greater. But we didn't see it. Television was banned, journalists were banned, foreigners were banned. We didn't see it. And all of that wealth went to white South Africans. People used to ask me in the 1980s whether I thought, South Africa would survive. And I would say, it depends if they follow the British royal tradition or the French royal tradition. If they keep going down this road, they'll have all of their heads chopped off. But if they adopt the British model, giving parliamentary power to people, eventually they'll be like the British royal family. Last time I looked, they weren't doing too badly. And people in South Africa are not doing too badly. Not all people. Not just white South Africans. There is a use of government power to acquire wealth. Now the difference is, for white South Africa, how many people were there, Adam? $1.2 million? Sitting on the richest natural resources in Africa, with the most developed economy, maintaining a police state in the most sophisticated modern economy that we couldn't see. I am not condoning what is happening. I just want to remind people that when we talk about the growing disparity in wealth in the last 20 years, we actually have to put it back. Well, I'll settle for the last 70 years. You know, there's an interesting discussion about the return of property taken during the Holocaust. I think nobody doubts that it probably should be returned. I mean, there are museums around the world that are giving back things, and if somebody can actually prove title to a home in Berlin, yeah, they've got a pretty good claim. You raise that question about most of the land that was taken from most of the people in South Africa, most of it after 1948, you will not get the same answer. I think we want to be treated just like every human being. And I also think we want to keep in perspective what is happening in South Africa.
And maybe that's why we ought to dream of futures. May I move to a second question, which troubles the very nature of Madiba as historical figure. On the announcement of his passing, the New York Times ran an unforgettable banner headline that referred to him as the conqueror of apartheid, an image that captures an almost global reaction. To be sure, Adam, you wrote in a tribute put out by Wits that he changed the world as we know it. To what extent is this reaction, understandable though it is to all of us, and indeed probably shared by all of us, an autonomic flight into big man history, the kind of liberal history that gave us Carlyle and the notion of history made by individuals, a history that may actually misrepresent the demise of apartheid and indeed the struggle against it, not to mention the role of Madiba himself, which arguably was the product of a complex world historical force, set of forces on the one hand, and the agency of a mass movement on the other. How do we read the heroic, the conqueror against, as it were, the social forces and the mass struggle that both produced the man and produced his historical effects? It's open to any one of you that want to address it. Start, Adam, with pleasure.
Look, I mean, I think that there's two things. I think South Africa wouldn't have happened. The democratization of South Africa wouldn't have happened without certain structural features in the world in the late 1980s. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the re-emergence of mass struggle in South Africa. You are absolutely correct. The fact that we had not only a sanctions campaign, but an anti-apartheid movement that went global and that popularized the name of Nelson Mandela. Remember, by the late 1970s, an entire new generation could no longer remember this name. This was the mythology of Madiba, was in effect created by the ANC. They honed him on him, and they used him to popularize the name through the anti-apartheid struggles throughout the 1980s. They really did make the person. And so there's a whole series of structural and individual and agential variables other than Madiba. However, I do think that Madiba himself played a fundamental role. And that fundamental role I come back to was 1993. Then when Chris Hani was killed, and you spoke to the leadership of the ANC, almost all said, we go to war. There was a real commitment to going to war. And it was Madiba who stands up and says that this is not the moment of war, that you use this incredible, tragic moment as the basis and leverage for which to move for peace. And it is precisely that creates this. So he does play a fundamental role. I'm not a subscriber of big man history. But if there is a big man in this equation, it has to be Nelson Mandela. It has to be that.
That's a truly vice-chancellorial answer. Achille.
I know he refuses to be the big man of Wits University, although there are forces.
It's fine.
Yes, is it? Yes, I agree with what Adam is saying. That, I mean, big man history is flawed when it comes to writing the history of the struggle in South Africa. But it seems to me that each struggle, especially mass struggle, where leadership and masses have to come together to constitute themselves as a force against other forces, has historically required a name. You need a name, it has a face, it has a voice, it has a signature, an emblem. And Mandela became that name and that voice for the struggle in South Africa. He became the name of an idea. And the struggle succeeded, at least with all the provisos we can put into this, partly because Mandela became its concept. And a struggle without a concept leads nowhere. And at times, the concept has to take the image of a human body to which people relate to. And that mythological or that dimension, imaginary dimension of struggle for emancipation is absolutely important and is missing in most of the mobilizations we see today.
So it's an argument for embodiment as much as it is an argument for agency. Margie.
I want to take you back to what it was like to be a young white South African from a non-political family in the 1960s. When I arrived back from the United States, Mandela and just about everybody else had gone to prison. But it was preceded by the banning of the African National Congress and the Communist Party and everybody else. And so even then, he was a non-figure in my life. I mean, a complete non-figure. I didn't know what he looked like. I didn't know who he was. And if anything, the notion that you would have, quote, an armed struggle, unquote, against this juggernaut of apartheid, it seemed not realistic. And so, again, I agree with Professor Mbembe that the first, more than 15 years was the anti-apartheid struggle. It didn't have a name. That's what it was. It was the anti-apartheid struggle. And if anybody, Albert Luthuli was the person we respected. Albert Luthuli was the former head of the African National Congress, who was the first African to win the Nobel Prize, and had been banned and isolated to a tiny remote village. And one of the things that Senator Robert Kennedy did when he went to South Africa, and nobody knew how he pulled this off, I mean, I was with him the whole of his trip, was he visited Albert Luthuli. And for the first time, we saw photographs of what Luthuli looked like. So, yes, there was a very strong anti-apartheid movement. There was a sports boycott that was very successful. White South Africans are crazy about sports. Dennis Brutus, a wonderful man, led the international effort for a sports boycott. There were just many pieces to it, and I think what you see is not just the external anti-apartheid movement or the internal anti-apartheid movement. Helen Suzman, wonderful, feisty, short woman, the only real progressive in Parliament at the time, arranging for people to get books and letters into prison, absolutely critical. I mean, you didn't know, but I think by the end of the 1980s, when the whole movement was converging internally and externally, then to have somebody like Nelson Mandela made a huge, huge difference.
Actually, putting those three answers together really does produce a revisionist reading of the historical struggle, which both periodizes it, locates the emergence of Mandela, as it were, congealing the party through a process of embodiment and metonymy, and then taking on an agency, which is not the way that South African history is written at the moment at all. So maybe from precisely this archaeology will come a new historiography. I'm going to change that. Sorry, Margaret.
Can I just mention one thing that shocked me to give you some sense of what it was like? Chief Luthuli died in 1967. And I was then the head of the National Union of Students, and I thought it was unconscionable not to be present at that funeral. So I attended the funeral. There were about 10, 12 white people. There was a consul general from the United States, there was a consul general from Sweden, I think there was an ambassador from Sweden, the consul general for England, and one or two other people, and me, and almost nobody else. I, by the way, was outraged that the United States had only sent its consul general and not its ambassador. He had by then won the Nobel Prize. And there were thousands of people, thousands, at this tiny, tiny little church. And, there were lots of white South Africans. They were all police. There were plenty of them, all around. Plain clothes, non-plain clothes, unbelievable. And everybody came to this funeral, and his coffin was finally carried in, and it was draped with the African National Congress flag. And his pallbearers wore the classic African National Congress uniform, which you can't miss. It's a khaki uniform and has a sort of military khaki cap, the lowest status in a military army usually. And I was standing next to a young black student, and he turned to me and he said, "You see, Margie, the ANC is not dead." That young man was Stephen Biko. So, yes, it's not the party, but it is the party. And for me, that was the most immediate awakening, that something was going on about which I really didn't know or didn't understand.
An interesting question that raises, by the way, for the historiography of South Africa, is the degree to which the ANC, in retrospect, has written black consciousness, the Pan-African Congress, etc., out of the history, looking from the present back to those moments. But
and we do the same, don't we?
Pardon?
And we do the same.
Of course we do the same. That's Victor's history. We all do it, we all read it, we all criticize it, and that's partly why we're here. Achille, I'd like to direct the next question at you by doing what I just did to Adam, and that is quote yourself to yourself. An unfair labor practice, I know, but nonetheless we do it. You're quoted in the Economic and Social Justice Reality Report of last December. I love the thought of an Economic and Social Justice Reality Report, as if there's that much of it out there. You say there has only ever been one Mandela, and there will never be another. In Le Monde Diplomatique, a couple of months before, you spoke of him as perhaps the last in a line of great men doomed to extinction. Now, in the first instance, is the first of the two quotes not a challenge to those who would include other icons of the 20th century, the likes of Gandhi, of Martin Luther King? And in second, in saying that there will never be another of such great persons, is this because post-20th century conditions have erased the possibility for the emergence of the mythic global icon? Is it because the nature of political struggles has changed? Is it because, well, one simply can't imagine individual heroism of this magnitude arising ever again? What precisely did you have in mind in those two statements?
That's a hard one.
This is the trouble when everyone is asked exam questions in which you, the quotee, know you're in trouble.
I think that the Mandela, Gandhi, King triangulation, I wish we could invite Skip to South Africa to talk to us about this. It seems to me that if we were to look into this from where we stand, where we come from, into what the 20th century will have signified for us, we would probably say that to a large extent, the project of liberation from colonial rule and racial oppression has defined that century. That the defining feature of the 20th century has been the struggle of more than 2/3 of the people in the planet to free themselves from both forms of subjugation, which to a large extent have gone hand in hand. No colonialism without racism, no racism without some form of division of people between subjects and natives. It seems to me that what Mandela, what Gandhi, and what King do is to turn these particular struggles into struggles for redefinition of the human. And that what is at stake in them is an attempt at redefining the human, not only as something common, but as a future that is open to all. And heroism takes a meaning within that kind of projection towards what is not yet there, but a projection that has a universal, let's say, dimension. Now, it's very difficult to see in these times of ours, with the molecularization of struggles, the segmentation of interests, the ephemerality of forms of mobilizations, and the faceless, somewhat, character of most of these mobilizations, it's difficult for me to see what meaning heroism might still take. That's why I was suggesting that Mandela might have been the last hero of the 20th century.
I think that you're right. I think it would be great to invite Skip and indeed to have a really deep conversation, rather than a trivial conversation, of the triangulation of Gandhi, Madiba, and Martin Luther King. There is, I think, a profound lesson to be learned from that, again, in the critical rather than in the hagiographic voice. Adam, may I move on to you for now? And I'd like to put two questions together in the interest of shrinking time, so to speak. You opened by talking about Madiba's pragmatism. And in that same statement of Wits, which I should add is an extremely eloquent assessment of the life and times of Madiba, you make the argument that his pragmatism and his progressivism were not antithetical to one another. They could live together. Of course, a view that is controversial in itself, partly it is exactly that angered Andile and Pitama, right? Coupled to that question is a question that circulates in South Africa, and that is the acknowledgement in Long Walk to Freedom and elsewhere by Madiba of his Marxism and what he learnt about it in respect precisely of race and class, of inequality, and indeed of dreaming of the future. Now, to what extent do you think that Madiba's Marxism has anything to say anymore to South Africa, or is it a dead letter? Can the equation of pragmatism and progressivism be read entirely in the liberal terms of the moment?
Well, let me start off by making a more generic comment on pragmatism and progressive struggles, because I think that in the public discourse, and in particularly the academic and activist discourse, there's an assumption made that if you're progressive, you cannot be pragmatic. And I think it's an incredibly dangerous position to take. It's this assumption that if you were to lead a progressive struggle, you have to eventually die. Because it's the death that glorifies it. It's this grand moment. And it seems to me that what Madiba does is he transcends that in quite powerful ways. So, I mean, if you go back even over the last 100 years, if you look at notions in Marxism around Trotsky's transitional program, or the entire thought of Antonio Gramsci, it's all about trying to understand how do you lead a progressive struggle in a world context that is not of your own making? How do you link a struggle in the reality of the today and in the moment of today? And how do you advance a struggle without completely trying to think it through in completely romantic terms? It's a thing that I often have with colleagues at the universities. If you read the debate on commercialization and of universities, and that the universities have become corporate entities, what I'm often struck by is how people think of the university as the vision of the society they want rather than the society that exists now. And I often wonder that if you want to manage an institution like this, you've got to grapple with how do you lead an institution towards a progressive goal in the context you live today. And that is effectively the challenge that it seems to me that Madiba put onto the table, that you had to compromise. Because if you didn't compromise, and this is what Andile forgets, then what we would have had in South Africa is today what exists in Palestine or Israel, in what exists in large parts of the Sudan, in what exists in Egypt and in Syria. That was the alternative. So the question is, do you make some advance, knowing that that advance itself may be compromised, and then use that advance as the basis for a new advance? Which is why, Margaret, I raised the issue. Political inclusion that Madiba facilitated in 1994 was fundamental advance in South Africa.
That's correct.
But the question that remains, if we don't build on that advance today towards an economic inclusion project, then we'll unravel all of the sacrifices that were made in 1994 itself. Society progresses through continuous advances. And it seems to me that that's the challenge we confront today. You ask the question, does Madiba's Marxism have a relevance? If Madiba's Marxism raises the banner of inequality, then it is the fundamental question of the 21st century. If the 20th century was the struggle for equality of all people, the 21st century is going to be the struggle against inequality and transcending it. And that applies to the United States as much as it applies to South Africa, as much as it applies to Brazil or Western Europe or large parts of Asia. It is the fundamental question of our time, and it will produce its own heroes and its own heroines. It will produce its own struggle leaders, but it is a fundamental question that we collectively have to address as society and humanity as a whole.
And what it puts on the agenda is the need to confront the question, how? Because ultimately, we have any number of politics against, any number of politics that are prepared to argue about how one deconstructs and criticizes the present. The question is how to make the dream of the future, in fact, realizable. So thank you for that, and that's something that, in effect, ought to be on all of our intellectual, all of our critical scholarly agendas. I want to change direction somewhat, or, to quote the late Monty Python's Flying Circus, now for something completely different. Much rumor and gossip over the years since 1994 has surrounded the divorce of Nelson and Winnie Mandela. An argument has been made that whatever the personal reasons for that divorce, their breakup really marked a fission between two tendencies in South African politics. Tendencies rooted in generational differences and the bifurcation between the street and civility in South African politics. Nelson standing for party discipline, for the parliamentary, for polite society. Winnie standing for an angry, unfulfilled youth, for violent revenge, and for uncompromising restitution. It is a mythos that continues to be reiterated in South Africa. How valid is this reading of the relationship between the personal and the political? How valid is this a reading of the deep generational struggle in contemporary South Africa? And I put it to any of the three of you who wishes to address it.
Okay.
With pleasure.
I think that's exactly right. I think that precisely, there's two things I want to say about this. The first is the issue and how important it is that there are two traditions. The one tradition was the tradition of political inclusion that Madiba and party discipline that Madiba brought to the table. What he also brought was pragmatism and the need to compromise, but in a way that advances that. But there is a second tradition that says enough has not translated on the ground. And when you quote Andile, Andile's voice resonates through Winnie Mandela.
That's exactly why I quoted him.
And Andile says that too much compromise in 1994 was precisely why we're in the mess we are in. My own view, however, is 1994 was necessary without the compromise. But what we need to do is move to the second stage. Because if we fail the second stage, then we put at threat the primary stage itself. I do want to say one other thing, however, which is a more personal thing. One of the debates that is happening in South Africa is why did Winnie get left out of her will?
I was going to ask you that, so you run ahead of me.
And so I was sitting in Cape Town when a couple of months, about a month after Madiba had passed on. And two policemen, I was having a cup of coffee in a mall in Cape Town, and two policemen went past, and one of them stopped and said to me, "Can you tell me what do you think about Madiba's will?" Now, Madiba had left a small grant for Wits University. So I obviously, as the chief bureaucrat at Wits, started speaking about how generous he had been, etc. And they said to me, "Well, we're not really interested in that. What we're really interested in is why did he leave Winnie out of his will?" And I then said to them, "Well, how would you read that?" And they said to me, "This is the biggest conversation in the townships." And the biggest conversation is that Madiba, and this is what they reflected on, Madiba had not mentioned Winnie because he had felt betrayed. That she had had an affair, and therefore he saw that as a betrayal of the very soul. And what they said is it's easy to forgive the architects of apartheid who hurt your body. But when the love of your life betrays your soul, then it was much harder to forgive. And I thought to myself, is this not an interesting reflection about sex, love, betrayal, and in the life of perhaps the greatest political reconciler of the 20th century? And it's something that I think we haven't thought about, that what we haven't reflected enough of is not simply the formal Nelson Mandela, the reconciler in public life, but the struggles of Madiba in his private life, and how that may have impacted on him, and how that, because ultimately it's worth bearing in mind that there were huge costs paid by this man, not in in the sense of himself. But Winnie herself had spent dark years defending him and keeping that flag and that flame burning of South African liberation. And the effect that this has truly had on their complex existence is something, is a story that's not been told. And I suspect it's a story that cannot be told by a social scientist. It's a story that needs to be told by a poet and artist. And perhaps that's something that Wole Soyinka.
However, as a political thinker, you've just spoken about it deeply poetically. Achille, you want to say something?
Just to add to what Adam has said, it would be interesting to read Nelson Mandela's Conversations with Myself, which is not spoken about as much as Long Walk to Freedom. Read it in tandem with Winnie Mandela's latest book, which is her diary, the diary of the time she spent in detention. Totally horrific. Both of them went to jail, but were treated in two very different ways. So read all of that, and The Cry of Winnie Mandela by your former colleague Njabulo Ndebele, who is indeed trying to render this drama in poetic and artistic forms. But just one little thing. When Mandela and Winnie divorced, Winnie, it's now a matter of public knowledge, wanted 50% of his assets. He didn't want to give that amount, but he gave her something, as a result of which she didn't need to appear on his last will.
Can I say one other thing? Sorry.
Very briefly, Adam, because time is running out.
When I went to Madiba's home, when he had passed on, and one of the most poignant moments I thought was, I'd come in and Gracia was there, and we had paid our respects, and just about 5 minutes before we left, Winnie came with Zinzi. And of course they came, and Winnie had stood at the door very quietly. And then as she had paid her respects and went and stood back at the door. And there were two chairs. One was where Gracia was sitting, and the other one was empty where Madiba sat. And just before we left, Gracia said to Winnie, "Come sit on this chair." And Winnie came and they sat on this chair. And I thought it was the most poignant moment, because from then on, that afternoon, they both received guests to the Madiba household. And I thought it was a really very gracious moment where Gracia, recognizing, if you like, in symbolic terms, the enormous contribution of Winnie, and brought them together to receive those who were bereaving Madiba. And I thought it was perhaps the most poignant moment of that entire tragic episode of this death.
Margie.
I'm not going to touch it.
I was going to make... Actually, I was going to make a comment about it being a judge and hoping that you never had to deal with divorce proceedings, but I'll pass on that.
Again, I'm not going to make a comment on their relationship. I'm not going to comment on why he kept her out of the will. I'm not going to comment. I mean, I just think we can't own that. We can't own that. And I think that we admire, we love, we respect this man, and there are still parts of his that are private. And that's the way it should be. I do want to clarify, Adam, in case you misapprehended what I was saying about the Afrikaner Party. Perhaps I'm oversensitive, but I sometimes hear in criticisms about South Africa that, I mean, John, it comes back to your point about what are the mechanisms. For many, many years, the power of occupying the government has been used to acquire wealth. I don't think it's a very successful mechanism any longer, partly because when it goes hand in hand with democratic things, it's too visible. But in much of the criticism about what is happening now in South Africa, it seems to me that there's a sort of hidden assumption that no place in Africa can run a democratic country without, getting all of the wealth to itself. And I just always think that that is a terribly, terribly unfair way to look at what is happening in South Africa. I absolutely agree with you that the challenge of the 20th century is not over, and a huge challenge in the 21st century, whether it's in Russia, the United States, South Africa, or wherever it is the growing wealth inequality. But it's not peculiar to South Africa, and it's not because South Africa happens to be on the African continent. That's my only point.
And in effect, the moral of the story is that we ought not merely to dream of the future, but actually to make it out of those lessons. Indeed, thank you all three of you. I should say at this point, and on the ground that every wise man, or in my case, aspiring wise man, gives the last word to his spouse. I should therefore like to ask Jean Comaroff to offer a brief closing statement.
Thank you very much. The meanings of Mandela, at least in the form that we have chosen to honor him here today, remain inescapably plural, provocative, alive, open-ended. That much I think we've seen very dramatically in front of us here. They challenge us not merely to celebrate his extraordinary, almost unprecedented stature as statesman, moral being, opponent of institutional racism and inequality, as we've heard in South Africa and the world at large. They demand, too, that we probe the strange alchemy of history and personality, as we've just done right now, that make him a kind of magnificent anomaly, if you like, a truly modern hero in what are cynical late modern times, a terrorist and a revolutionary turned avuncular messiah, a pillar of sober righteousness with a residual fondness for pretty women and indeed flashy shirts. So the sense of bereavement at the news of his passing was indeed global in scale and infinitely Catholic in significance, and we've had some sense of the diversity here. For Mandela was and is a myth, the word we use over and over again, a myth to be conjured with in jaded, spiritless times. Notwithstanding the more complex and complicating facts of his life and legacies we've just heard, he embodied a refusal to despair, to compromise in the face of injustice, to lose faith with the rectitude of popular struggle. And as we've heard, this remains a very important dimension. As many have noted, there was in his later life a kind of innocence or wonderment about him, a sort of wise simplicity that was possibly born of his years of stoic isolation from the world. But for many, his death deprived us of the last credible link, it seemed, and I think this is clear in what Achille was saying, of a time when the terrain of struggle seemed more clear-cut, a time when we were not embarrassed yet by utopian dreams and not prompted to put scare quotes around terms like emancipation or the politics of the common good, indeed politics itself. So it's the paradoxical quality of his greatness that makes Mandela so intriguing and so enduringly relevant to the world that he's left behind him, even while he's canonized into a saint, a peacemaker, a conciliator. And certainly, of course, his life and times lent themselves to myth-making, from his days as the Black Pimpernel on the run from the South African police, through his time as the world's most uncompromising prisoner of conscience, to the period when his moral authority seemed uniquely capable of making apartheid's unbending leaders concede to the inevitability of history. The Madiba mythology was an increasingly global production, painting him in terms that Wole has mentioned, in Promethean terms that severed him in many ways as hero from his comrades, from the social movement he was part of, from the historical conditions of which he was an inseparable part. And this detachment of his image from the messier personal and political facts and gave him a kind of global portability, I would say, and permitted his persona to circulate as the sublime object we've been celebrating here this afternoon, an infinitely attractive touchstone for tolerance, forgiveness, appeals to our better nature. And the mystique was irresistible. And it was a pageant, I suggest, in which Mandela himself was a very knowing participant. He had a genius for politics as theatre, for the use of ritual to produce effects beyond the reach of more ordinary action. His blood-chilling speech from the dock, for instance, in which he offered his life in the struggle for freedom, or that Invictus moment in which he urged South Africa's national team to an improbable victory in the 1995 Rugby World Cup, and with it inspired a divided nation to try and imagine themselves as a future in unity. It's probably not unfair to say that during his time as president, his role was ceremonial to a large degree. He reigned more than he ruled, if I can put it that way. The actual business of state-making, much of it much less edifying, took place often behind the scenes. And after a single term in office, he stepped down, making plain how well he understood the basis of his own greatness, that the most effective means of retaining power was to let it go. It would be churlish to discount the value of all of this. And yet Mandela in life resisted dissolving into myth. The saint was never fully separated from the old street fighter. For there remains a grittier undertow to the meaning of Mandela, the firebrand after all, who opted, when all else failed, to oppose oppression with violence, to fight fire with fire. This legacy was never fully eclipsed by the genial architect of the Rainbow Nation, especially, as we've heard, with a hardening of realities in South Africa in the decades after apartheid. For the civic revolution that so inspired the world has fallen somewhat short, as we've been discussing, from radically engaging the racialized economic inequalities that still keep so many South Africans in chains. As the euphoria abated, South Africa became in many ways yet another late modern nation, struggling to build democracy in neoliberal times, striving to face the mounting frustration of those whose hopes have so long been postponed. Amidst all this, Mandela often seemed to be a kind of genial anachronism, lending his image uneasily to a movement that had increasingly forsaken his vision. But I think it's precisely that discrepancy, this palpable gap between Mandela the myth and the grubbier world that claims him, between Mandela the peacemaker and Mandela the troublemaker, that keeps his legacy so vibrantly alive. It continues to fuel critique, as we've heard, especially of those who've betrayed the people's trust. At the globally televised memorial for Mandela, held in Soweto last December, a somber crowd assembled alongside heads of state from across the world. As the microphone moved to the current state president, a man widely held to have brought the national project in disrepute, there were those who couldn't contain their anger any longer. They began first hesitantly, then resoundingly to boo him. Now, it was a provocative gesture that many would condemn, but many others would see it as a new kind of opening, a statement of emboldened popular resolve. For them, it was a defiant tribute to the old troublemaker himself, an expression of a widely shared sense of his memory being impugned, his vision of democracy being sold short. It was above all evidence that Mandela's meaning remains a challenging, vital, evolving element in the world that he left behind. And I ask you now, please, to all rise for the singing of the South African national anthem.
South die diepte van ons ziel, oor ons eeuwige gebaartes, wordt die kranse antwoord hier. Sounds the call to come together, and united we shall stand. Let us live and strive for freedom in South Africa, our land.
I'd simply like to thank each of you for joining us in this afternoon's historic event and invite you to join me in thanking our speakers, readers, panelists, photojournalists, and of course the Kuumba singers. Thank you.